What separates a duck hunter who fills his limit 3 mornings in a row from the one hunting the same public water who goes home with 2 birds and a story about how the ducks weren't flying? Tommy Garrett had hunted the same 2,000-acre managed marsh in western Tennessee for 31 years, and the first morning I hunted with him, I watched him kill 6 birds in 40 minutes on water that the 3 hunters in the next blind over were struggling to work a single flock on. Same water, same morning, same weather. Tommy had more birds in the bag by 8 a.m. than the other blind would put in the boat all morning. On the drive out afterward, I asked him what he was doing that they were not. He said it simply. They were hoping birds would come to them. He was already where the birds had decided to go before he ever dropped the tailgate. That principle drives every trick on this list. 27 techniques from hunters who consistently fill limits are not about calling harder or buying better gear. They are about positioning yourself inside decisions birds have already made. The payoff at the end covers the one scouting habit that Tommy told me made everything else on the list possible, and there is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service telemetry study behind it that explains precisely why the habit works at a biological level most hunters have never considered. The evening before scout is the foundation that every other trick on this list sits on. A 30-minute observation session from a distance, binoculars on the water at last light, watching where birds are committing as they finish their evening feeding movement, gives you information about tomorrow morning that no amount of experience on that specific piece of water can substitute for. Birds are not random in their location choices. They use specific water for specific reasons: food concentration, water depth, cover proximity, and freedom from disturbance. A mallard that drops into the northwest corner of a flooded field at 4:30 p.m. will return to that corner at first light because it is the corner where the food concentration and water depth matched what the bird needed previous evening. Position on that corner before dawn. Every hunter who shows up at first light without having watched the previous evening is guessing. The second hour is the most consistently underused window on pressured public water, and the reason is one of the most predictable patterns in duck hunting. First light produces birds that are moving from overnight roost locations to feeding water on their own schedule before any hunting pressure has organized them. The second hour, roughly 8 to 10 in the morning, produces birds that have been scattered by the first light shooting across the entire marsh and are now searching for undisturbed water to settle on. Birds in that post-pressure settling movement have shorter decision windows and lower caution thresholds than birds in the pre-dawn movement. Hunters who stay through the second hour consistently outperform the first light-only crowd on pressured public water. The birds that were not cooperative at sunrise are the birds that become cooperative once the shooting pressure from every other hunter's first light setup has scattered them, and they are actively looking for somewhere safe, land. Weather fronts are the most reliable production windows in a duck season, and the specific timing matters more than most hunters realize. The 24 hours before a major cold front arrives produces birds that are actively feeding before conditions change, and have not yet learned to associate your specific location with danger. The first 2 days after a front passes produces birds that moved in with the front, have no local hunting pressure history on your water, and are actively looking for food after the movement. Hunters who plan their best hunting days specifically around these 2 windows rather than hunting fixed schedules access birds at their most cooperative twice per front. A strong cold front every 10 to 14 days across a typical duck season gives you 6 to 8 of these windows across the full season. Know which side of the front you are on and what that side produces. Before you commit to a blind location on any morning, walk or boat 100 yards away from your setup, roughly the length of a football field, and look back at your spread from the bird's approach angle. What you see in that 30-second assessment is exactly what approaching birds see, and it will reveal setup problems that you cannot identify from inside the blind. Shorelines that looked well covered from behind are often completely open from the water. Decoy configurations that seemed natural from the bank read as staged from 100 yards out. Blind profiles that disappeared into the vegetation when you were looking at them from 5 feet away are visible above the cover line from water level. This 2-minute investment before every single hunt catches the problems that would otherwise cost you birds all morning. And you would never diagnose from inside the blind because you would never see what the birds were seeing. Shoreline confidence decoys are the most overlooked visual element in a standard spread. A natural feeding or resting flock almost always has birds at the water's edge, on a mudflat, or standing on a protruding bank. A spread that is entirely floating on water looks staged from altitude on clear days when birds have enough visual information to make detailed assessments. 2 or 3 full-body or shell decoys placed on the shoreline, bank, or the nearest mud flat within the spread adds the specific visual element that reads as comfortable, settled birds rather than floating plastic. On bluebird low-pressure days, when birds are making their most careful approach assessments, shoreline decoys produce noticeably more committed final approaches than spreads without them. If you already own full-body decoys for any other purpose, this costs nothing and takes 90 seconds to add before every hunt. A jerk rig on late-season birds on pressured water is worth understanding at a mechanical level because the reason it works is different from the reason spinners work. Spinning wing decoys produce a specific rotational flash and motion signature that late-season birds on pressured water have been educated to associate with hunting pressure for 6 to 8 weeks. The jerk rig, a string or bungee system that creates surface ripple and decoy movement through a simple pull cord, produces a completely different visual motion pattern, the specific surface disturbance of a feeding or bathing bird pulling and splashing. That pattern does not carry the conditioned avoidance response that spinner motion has built on pressured water. The cost to build a basic jerk rig from hardware store components is under $15. Hunters who transition from spinner to jerk rig in the back third of the season on pressured public water consistently report improved results from birds that had been avoiding spinner-equipped spreads for weeks. Setting a spread parallel to the wind rather than into it is a geometry adjustment that changes what approaching birds see and where they land relative to the blind. Most hunters orient the spread so birds land directly into the wind and directly toward the blind, which puts committed birds flying straight at the hunters during final approach, with a direct sight line to the blind. The parallel wind setup positions the blind on the upwind edge of the spread, with the landing zone extending downwind along the wind line. Birds approaching from downwind see the full spread broadside, get a longer visual confirmation window during their descent, and land crossing in front of the blind at 10 to 20 yards rather than flying over it. On mornings when birds are making multiple passes and evaluating carefully, the geometry of where birds cross relative to the blind position determines shooting opportunities more than any calling adjustment. Motion decoy placement matters more than most hunters acknowledge, and the near-universal habit of placing motion decoys at the outer edge of the spread is the wrong placement for the wrong reason. The outer edge placement draws attention from distance, which is useful. But a motion decoy at the edge of a spread does not tell birds anything about the safety of the landing zone, which is the specific location they are aiming for. A single motion decoy, whether a swimmer or a splasher, placed in the center of the spread directly in or adjacent to the open landing zone, tells approaching birds that the spot they are targeting has active, comfortable, feeding birds already working it. That confirmation of the landing zone specifically is what produces the committed wings-locked final approach, rather than the circling assessment that birds make when the landing zone is static while motion is happening at the edges. Recording GPS coordinates for every productive morning stand with the specific conditions that made it productive, wind direction, water level, temperature range, and time of season, is the single practice that compounds most overtime of anything on this list. The stands that produced birds on one October morning with a northwest wind at 42 degrees will produce birds again when those conditions repeat, because the birds are responding to the same combination of food availability, cover proximity, and pressure patterns that made that location productive the first time. A notebook or phone note with 3 seasons of productive stand locations and their associated conditions is worth more than any scouting map for your specific water. Tommy Garrett kept a notebook for 31 seasons. He told me he had 63 stand locations on his marsh, with specific condition combinations attached to each one. He never guessed where to set up. Afternoons during the first 3 weeks of season are the most consistently ignored productive window available to most hunters. Early season teal and September ducks move actively in the 2 hours before sunset as temperatures drop and birds begin evening feeding movement. Birds that were pressured at first light have spent the midday resting and have not been shot at in hours. They are moving again before sunset toward feeding water with reduced caution and no recent negative experience from hunting pressure. An afternoon setup specifically on feeding water, not roost water, during the warm, early weeks of season, produces shots on birds that have been undisturbed all day. Most hunters hunt exclusively at first light because that is the tradition, and leave the afternoon window entirely to the birds. The funnel point pass shooting technique is the alternative for mornings when decoy setups on open water are producing nothing. On large managed marsh systems, rivers with multiple channels, and agricultural areas with scattered water, birds moving between roost locations and feeding areas consistently use specific terrain funnels. Narrow marsh passages, creek bends, gap points between timber blocks, or low spots between ridgelines. A single afternoon of driving county roads and glassing bird movement patterns identifies these funnels, which then become ambush locations requiring no decoys and minimal calling because birds passing through a funnel are already committed to a direction of travel. On days when pressure on the main hunting areas has birds not working to decoys anywhere, the funnel ambush produces birds that no decoy setup on open water was going to see. Hunting the backside of islands and points rather than the open face is one of the location adjustments that most hunters never make because the open face is visible from the water and easy to access by boat. The backside, the sheltered water behind a point or island, is where birds rest and feed on calm days, specifically because it provides protection from wind, wave action, and direct line-of-sight exposure from the main water. Birds using sheltered water behind a point are there for the same reasons birds use the inside bends of rivers and the protected corners of flooded fields. The physical conditions match what they need. Decoys set in the sheltered water with the blind tucked into the point itself produce committed approaches from birds that are actively seeking that type of water and would not have approached the open face regardless of calling. Quality. That covers the setup and location cluster, which is where most of the limit-filling decisions get made before any calling happens. You have probably had that morning where everything about your calling felt right, the sequences were clean, the birds were working, and nothing committed. If the setup was wrong, the calling could not fix it. The tricks in the first half of this list are the ones that put you in a position where average calling produces birds. The tricks in the second half are the ones that produce birds specifically from observation and timing decisions that most hunters never think to apply. Watching where cripples swim after every hunt tells you specifically where the security cover margins are that birds use as escape refuges during shooting pressure events. And those margins are almost always the same locations where undisturbed birds are resting and feeding between hunting pressure episodes. A crippled bird, swimming from the open spread toward the nearest heavy cover, is tracing the same route that healthy birds use to reach security cover when conditions pressure them off the main water. The margins that attract cripples attract healthy birds for the same reason. This information is available on every hunt where a bird is not cleanly recovered, costs nothing to collect, and builds a location intelligence picture of your specific marsh that no amount of preseason scouting produces. The buddy calling system, one hunter calling and one hunter watching birds and directing calling decisions through hand signals, produces better calling outcomes than two hunters calling simultaneously, and better than one hunter calling and watching at the same time. The caller focused on mechanics misses behavioral cues that the watcher sees from a neutral position. The watcher can signal stop, keep going, switch to feeding chuckle, or go completely silent based on real-time bird behavior that the caller is physically unable to see while blowing a call. This is the division of labor that experienced duck hunting pairs use without discussing it, and the specific reason that two hunter setups consistently outperform solo setups is not the two guns, but the two-roll system. The last legal hour of the day for divers on big water is the most consistently underused window in the entire duck season. Bluebills, redheads, ringnecks, and canvasbacks characteristically move to feeding areas in the last hour of legal shooting light on large lakes and reservoirs. Most hunters hunting big water systems leave by noon when morning action has slowed. The birds making their afternoon feeding movement to the same structure edge and deep flat locations they used in the morning are accessing water that has no hunting pressure on it for the rest of the day. A setup specifically on known diver feeding structure at 4 in the afternoon on a November afternoon with the right loads, bismuth or steel BB at minimum for big divers, and a diver-specific spread produces a concentrated flight that no amount of morning hunting effort accesses. Bismuth and TSS loads produce measurably cleaner kills at distances beyond 35 yards, roughly the distance from home plate to first base. than steel loads of equivalent size. The physics are documented. Steel's lower density means smaller pellet energy and less consistent penetration at distance compared to bismuth or tungsten at the same shot size. The cost premium is real, typically 2 to 3 times the cost of comparable steel loads. The performance difference at 40 to 50 yards is equally real. For hunters who regularly take shots at 40 yards and beyond, the investment in bismuth or TSS eliminates most of the cripples that leave the water. Fewer cripples means fewer disturbance events from retrieves, more birds in the bag, and less ethical discomfort from birds that were hit but not recovered cleanly. Matching wader type to water temperature rather than calendar date is a comfort variable that affects hunting performance more than most hunters acknowledge. Cold hunters move more, call less carefully, and leave the blind earlier than comfortable hunters. The specific guidance: 5 millimeters, neoprene for water temperatures below 45 degrees, 3.5 millimeters for 45 to 55, and breathable for anything warmer. One pair of properly fitting waders in the right insulation weight is worth more than 2 pairs that are wrong for the conditions. The hunters who consistently stay through the second hour, through the slow mid-morning, and through the late diver flight in November are almost always the hunters who are dressed correctly for the actual conditions. Physical misery produces early exits at exactly the moments when patience produces birds. The most experienced hunter I have been in a blind with, who consistently stayed longer than anyone else, told me he had spent more money on waders than on any other piece of equipment he owned. He said a cold hunter is a hunter who leaves, and leaving is how you miss birds. Patterning your specific choke and load combination on paper at 25 and 35 yards before the season tells you what your actual effective range looks like and eliminates the guesswork that costs birds. Most hunters are running a modified choke with standard steel loads and have no accurate mental picture of what the pattern density looks like at various distances. A full choke or aftermarket extended choke tuned for steel or bismuth loads at 25 yards, about the distance from the foul line to the batter's box, produces a substantially tighter pattern than a modified choke at the same distance. Pattern the actual combination you use on actual paper, and you will see the difference in a way that changes how you think about distance. Know your limits and species before you pull the trigger. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Migratory Bird Regulations booklet is free, available online, and covers every species, limit, and zone for your state. Federal duck stamp, HIP registration, species identification by wing pattern and silhouette at distance, and daily bag limits that vary by species are all mandatory knowledge. This is the most serious legal exposure in waterfowl hunting, because species misidentification under pressure is the most common violation, and it is entirely preventable. 2 hours with the regulations booklet before opening day and 30 minutes with actual wing samples or identification resources produces the species identification confidence that every duck hunter should have before the first shot of the season. Using Canada goose flags over a duck spread on marsh systems that hold both species pulls geese that would otherwise pass over your position without investigating. A single flag waved at low-flying geese produces goose opportunities that hunters running duck-only setups never access without adding a single goose decoy to the spread. Check your state regulations on this specific application, but on most managed public water in the Midwest and Mid-South, flagging Canada geese over a duck spread is legal and regularly productive. Mixed bag mornings that include both mallards and Canada geese from the same setup are available on most Mississippi Flyway managed marshes and almost entirely ignored by hunters who are set up exclusively for ducks. This is the one that Tommy Garrett told me changed everything else, and I want to explain it the way he explained it to me, because the framing matters. The specific scouting habit that makes every other technique on this list more effective is not complicated. It is simply going to the water you plan to hunt the evening before, staying at a distance that does not disturb the birds, watching through binoculars for 30 minutes, and noting specifically which locations birds are committing to as they make their evening feeding and settling movement, not which locations had birds flying over. Specifically, where birds committed, folded their wings, and set down. That location is where they have already decided to be. A U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service telemetry study on mallard movement patterns in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley documented that individually marked birds returned to feeding locations used the previous evening within 100 yards of the previous evening's position on 73% of subsequent mornings under stable weather conditions. 73%. The birds are not random. They are making location decisions based on food and safety information gathered the previous evening. Position where they decided to go, not where you hope they will come. The hunters who fill limits consistently are not better callers than the hunters around them, and they are not running more sophisticated spreads. They are set up inside decisions birds already made. Duck hunting is not complicated at its core. The birds know where they want to be. Your job is to figure out where that is before they get there, be invisible when they arrive, and confirm with your spread and your call that the location is safe. Everything on this list is in service of those three things. Pick 2 or 3 from the location cluster and apply them this season before anything else. The calling and gear improvements follow from being in the right place. They cannot compensate for being in the wrong one.